All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek. Today we are in week 44 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus from the book 52 Weeks with Jesus by James Merritt. After today, we have only 8 more weeks. Our one today puts us at the end of the 6th section of this book, which is called Jesus the Helper. And we've seen over and over Jesus go up to some of the most unfortunate, the outcast, the abused, the shunned, the lost, all of those people, and accept them. And we've even seen a rich young ruler come up to Jesus throughout this section right here. And when they realized that Jesus could change a person's heart, a person's broken mind, then they were people who themselves were changed by the love of Jesus Christ. Well, today we're going to see that once again. The title of today's lesson is Our Best Friend. It's another famous story of an encounter that Jesus had with someone who was searching for him, and we see the unexpected happen, at least unexpected when it comes to what the world would be thinking. Today we look at the famous man from the famous child song anyway, Zacchaeus. And we're going to look at his story as it takes place in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. So let's see what those verses say. He, meaning Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, this is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, where we have an encounter with Jesus and someone who was seriously lost. Someone who was despised, someone who was hated, who was an outcast to everyone. As kids, we used to sing that song growing up. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. I did a sermon on Zacchaeus and that song last year in our Soak, Songs of a Kid series. It's a well-known story with a lot of implications tied into it. But once again, the main one we're going to see once again today is that your past doesn't matter. Who we are at this moment may not even matter. What really matters is who we are from this moment on right here. And once again, we see that with Jesus, an encounter with the chief tax collector named Zacchaeus takes place. And so as we get started, Merritt starts this chapter off by talking about about being rejected by others. Have you ever been rejected by someone? Maybe it was rejected for a job. Maybe rejected when you tried to purchase something because it was either sold out or, hey, your card didn't work and was declined. Maybe it was just being rejected by someone in general. Rejection is not fun, is it? And there's all sorts of levels of it when it comes to rejection, but no matter what the level is, we don't like feeling rejected. Well, Merritt tells the story of a beautiful 21-year-old woman named Vicki Harrison, who seemed to have it all going for her. She was a blonde, she had a sweet personality, she had great ambition, seemed like she had a bright future for her life. And then tragically, she killed herself after more than 200 unsuccessful job applications. At one time, she had dreams of being a television producer. She also had dreams of being a teacher at one time, but she gave up on her futures. She wrote heartbreaking notes to her parents and to her boyfriend, just saying that, I don't want to be me anymore. and she took a huge drug overdose and died. She had had enough rejection in her life that she just couldn't deal with anymore. She couldn't deal with the thought even of more rejections. So she took her own life. It's a sad story, but in reality, we can read about people, stories about people like this, and rejection on a daily basis, can't we? In the Bible, there was someone who experienced rejection. Many people, but someone specific we're looking at today was this man named Zacchaeus. I just read his story, and from reading that story, we don't really get the understanding of how he was rejected by so many, by everyone really. But Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Now, if we know anything about tax collectors, what is it? You know, if we know anything about tax collectors today, what is it? They were despised, weren't they? They were hated by everyone. And why was that? Why were tax collectors so despised and hated? Well, they were despised and hated because they were seen as robbers and thieves. And Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector. He was a chief tax collector. And we'll talk about that here in a bit. But Zacchaeus being a tax collector meant that he was shunned. He was disliked. He was really hated by everyone in Israel. His family would have disowned him. His friends would have just deserted him. And everybody despised him. He was hated because of what he did for a living. So how would you feel if you were hated because of your job? That's how it was for Zacchaeus. And his rejection had been earned, honestly. The name Zacchaeus means pure or innocent. And he was anything but that. He was dirty and he knew it. Everybody in his community, they knew who he was. They knew what his job was and they hated him for it. So whenever it was possible, they stayed as far away from Zacchaeus as they could. It was a reasonable rejection. For tax collectors, there were three places in Israel where they collected these taxes. There was Capernaum, there was Jericho, and there was Jerusalem. Capernaum was about 120 miles north of Jerusalem. Jericho, though, was only about 17 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And it was by far, they say, the most lucrative. Most people would think that it would be Jerusalem, but Jericho was considered to be the most lucrative of the three because it was a border city for Israel, and so it sat on an international crossroads right there. It was a place where the northern, the southern, the eastern, and the western highway routes all converged. So they had a lot of traffic coming through Jericho. Now when you get back to Zacchaeus, as I said earlier, he wasn't just a tax collector. He was a chief tax collector, which meant that he had other tax collectors who were working for him, doing all the dirty work. People who went out, collected their money, and then paid him the greatest part of their profit. As Merritt puts it, he would have been like a chief thief of the Roman IRS during those days. As much as we hate paying taxes, these tax collectors were worse than the system we have today. They seriously took advantage of you. Now, in first century culture in Israel, a chief tax collector was considered no better than a murderer or a thief. Here's the way the system kind of worked for a tax collector during those days. Have you ever had to bid on something? You know, if you bid on something, whether it's for an animal or for a car or at an auction or whatever, if you have, you understand the process, right? The person who bids the highest gets what it is they were bidding on. Well, for tax collectors, they would bid on their position, the place where they would collect those taxes. We talked about the three places. Knowing that even if they had to pay more than they really wanted to for this location, they could make it up by just collecting extra money. Because they were given a quota of taxes to collect, but they weren't limited to that quota. And this is where the bad name, this is where the bad reputation came in for tax collectors during those days. They made their money by adding a surcharge, something that we would think of like a user's fee here today. And that surcharge could be as high as they wanted it to be. There was no limit, really. And with these tax collectors being Jews, they were seen as robbing their own people. So their neighbors had to pay it, whether they liked it or not. Now this is where Zacchaeus is in life. A chief tax collector, hated by his people for basically robbing them. He was rejected, and it was a reasonable rejection. And then Jesus comes into town. And Jesus shows us how we can reach out to the rejected and what can happen when the rejected receive Jesus. He lets us know that we must be attractive to those who feel rejected. Think about it. It really makes sense. People who are rejected would love to have people accept them. Love to have people there for them. They would love to feel wanted by someone. And Jesus shows us how. And the first thing he shows us is that we have to be attractive to them. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with our looks when I'm talking about being attractive. It more means that we need to stand out to them. Well, here comes Jesus into Jericho, the place where Zacchaeus collects taxes. And when Jesus comes through, the streets are jammed. They are packed. People are lined up just to get a look at Jesus. Think about the streets of New York on Thanksgiving Day for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Every year they are packed. People lined up just to watch the show, to see everything. That's what this kind of would have been like. It was a standing room only crowd as Jesus came through. And then there's this Zacchaeus. I don't know how tall he was, but in those verses that I read earlier, we read that he was small in stature. Now, I'm not tall. I'm rather short, I guess. I'm around 5'7", and that may be with shoes on. I don't even know. I feel like I keep getting shorter as I get older. At least it feels that way. And there are places where at my height, I can have a difficult time seeing over people, especially if it's a flat ground and I'm having to stand behind people. Now, I imagine that Zacchaeus was even shorter than me. So what does Zacchaeus end up doing? He runs ahead of the crowd. He finds a sycamore tree. He climbs up in it just so he can get a look at Jesus. And this is one of those details that seems so minor to us. Have you ever climbed up in a tree? If so, what kind of tree was it? As a kid, we had an apple tree in our front yard. Climbed that thing many, many times while we were growing up. Just loved it. Never thought anything about it. It didn't mean anything good or bad. It's just what we did. But in the first century, it was considered undignified, even obscene to some people to see a man climb a tree. But you know what? That's how bad, that's how much Zacchaeus had to see Jesus. A chief tax collector puts his dignity, what little dignity that he had, aside just to get a look, to get a closer look at Jesus. But why would Zacchaeus be so determined? Remember, this is a man who is hated. This is a man who others would just stay away from. But for some reason, when he hears that Jesus is coming into town, he has a determination that many people just don't have. Then and today, you'd say. How many people do we know who have that type of determination just to get closer to Jesus? Well, Jesus had developed quite the reputation too at this time. For some, he was the greatest thing ever on earth, ever seen. For others, they hated him. Well, Jesus lets us know what those who hated him were saying about him. In Luke chapter 7, verse 34, the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, And you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Remember, Jesus is the man who would take chances that nobody else would take, who would take chances with people that nobody else would take. He was there for those who others wanted nothing to do with. And that included tax collectors. It included tax collectors so much that he made Matthew a tax collector, one of his disciples. He made Matthew the tax collector, one of his disciples. Think about that. People who felt unloved by everybody felt loved by Jesus. I love how Merritt puts it. Merritt says, the more those who are not followers of Christ are loved by those of us who are followers of Christ, the more open they may be to following Christ. What that says to me is that we have to be attractive to those who feel rejected. We have to stand out in love, because that's how Jesus did it, over and over and over. If you can remember from a couple of weeks ago, one of these things, it says that he looked at the man in love. But also we must be attracted to those who feel rejected. We have to be at a point in life where we as Christians, we not only look good to those who are rejected, but we need to be looking out for the rejected. The story of Zacchaeus, it appears in the Bible, not just because Zacchaeus went looking for Jesus, but also because Jesus went looking for him. Make no mistake about it. Jesus knew where he was going. He knew what was going on, and he knew what was going to happen in Jericho when he got there. He went there with a purpose. So think about this scene. It's a large crowd of people. Huge crowd. Jesus could have easily missed this wee little man that we sing about. If Jesus had kept his eyes on the road or just at eye level with those around him and never looked up into that tree, maybe he never sees Zacchaeus. And if he never sees Zacchaeus, we probably never even hear anything about Zacchaeus today. But Jesus found the man he was looking for. He found the man who was looking for him. And when he says Zacchaeus, when he sees him up in this tree, he doesn't just ignore him. He tells him, hurry down, come down, for I must stay at your house today. He doesn't ask him if he can stay at his house. He says, I must stay at your house. In other words, he says, I want to stay at your house. A tax collector, people. And Jesus is like, I want to stay at your house. Think about some of the worst people in our society, most hated people, and you going up to them and saying, hey man, I'd love to stay at your house. We just don't do those things, do we? But Jesus does it right here. Merritt puts it in an interesting way here. He says Zacchaeus was the type of man that would have eaten Thanksgiving dinner alone in today's world. Remember, his family would have disowned him. He wouldn't have received Christmas presents from anyone or birthday presents around in today's world. He wouldn't have even received simple happy birthday notes on Facebook because he wouldn't have any friends. If he had a barbecue at his house and he invited the whole town to come to this barbecue, he could have cooked all day and he would have still been eating by himself because nobody would want to come. But Jesus invites himself to his house. It's the only time where we read about Jesus inviting himself to be someone's guest. And it just so happens to be a chief tax collector. He could have stayed with anybody from that crowd. Remember, this is a large crowd of people excited to see him. He could have chosen anyone from that crowd and told them he wanted to stay at that house. Any of them would have loved for Jesus to go to their house, to be at their table. And Jesus doesn't invite himself to the most popular person, the most popular man in Jericho's house. He reached out to the reject because he was attracted to those who are rejected. And finally today, Merritt points out that we must be attentive to those who feel rejected. What does it mean to be attentive? You know, if I were to ask you what attentive means, what would you say being attentive means? In simple terms, A simple definition is that it means we pay close attention to something. Now, we're not told what all happened at the house of Zacchaeus. We don't know what dinner was like there. We don't know if Jesus stayed the night or anything like that. We don't get all of those details. And it really doesn't matter. But what did happen that day was that Zacchaeus was convicted and converted. He was a changed man, totally. Listen to these words again. I read them earlier from this story. These words from Luke chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. As Merritt puts it, Jesus was attentive to his greatest need. His greatest need wasn't money, because he had plenty of money. His greatest need wasn't being healed of some sickness. He was healthy. His greatest need wasn't even accepted, even though he was missing out on that. His greatest need was Jesus. And Merritt points out this, that according to the law then, in that first century, if a thief voluntarily confessed to stealing something, he had to restore what he had stolen up to 20%. That's the way the law was stated. Well, here's how much Zacchaeus had changed, how much he was convicted and converted here. He changed so much by his encounter with Jesus that he vowed to return 4 times what he had stolen from them. So imagine what Zacchaeus had to do next. This would have been tough. He had to go to these people's homes, people he had stolen from and robbed and charged more money just so he could become rich. He has to knock on their doors only to have them open it with a look of disgust on their face because they couldn't stand him. But then he would settle the score with them. If he had taken, say, 100 shekels from them before, he would pay them those 100 shekels and then give them 400 more on top of that. You see, this one encounter with Jesus, where Zacchaeus had to get as close to Jesus as he possibly could, changed who Zacchaeus was forever. And if we want to be different, we need to get as close to Jesus as we possibly can. Because when Jesus comes into your life, he not only makes us right with him, he makes us right with others. And when we get close to Jesus, we'll be attracted, and attentive to those who feel rejected. I want to thank you all for joining us here for our midweek, week number 42 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus. I hope you've enjoyed it. I look forward to seeing you guys next week.